The gates of Fort Carson materialized through the early morning haze at precisely 0630. Master Sergeant Elena Voss had seen 100 installations across 15 years of service, each with its own rhythm and culture, each presenting its own unique challenges during those first critical days. She slowed her vehicle at the checkpoint, noting the crisp efficiency of the guard shack operations as two soldiers processed the vehicle ahead of hers. Her orders sat ready in the passenger seat, reassignment paperwork that would transform this temporary stop into her next duty station. The vehicle ahead cleared, and she pulled forward, extending her military identification and orders through the window toward the gate officer. Lieutenant Brennan, according to his name tape, stood at parade rest initially before accepting her documents. His examination of her credentials lasted longer than necessary, eyes moving from the paperwork to her face with an expression that shifted from professional assessment to something else entirely. "Too many women in combat roles now," he said, the words emerging with a practiced casualness that suggested he had voiced this opinion before. The comment hung in the air between them, neither question nor statement requiring response, simply an observation delivered as fact. Voss maintained her professional bearing, citing the regulation that authorized her entry with valid orders and current identification. The morning air carried that particular stillness that precedes a Colorado sunrise, cool and thin at elevation, and she could hear the processing of other vehicles at adjacent gates, creating a rhythm of routine. Brennan held her documents a moment longer before requesting she pull to the side for additional verification, despite the clear validity of everything she had presented. His tone suggested this was standard procedure, though the three gate guards who had been processing other lanes now stood watching with expressions that indicated otherwise. She complied without protest, parking her vehicle in the designated area and observing through her mirrors as Brennan conferred with his three subordinates. The guards responded with nods and brief smiles, their body language suggesting agreement with something their officer had said, though his words did not carry across the distance. Have you ever arrived at a new duty station wondering what kind of command climate you were walking into? Voss thought, mentally cataloging the dynamics she was witnessing. Every installation from California to North Carolina had its own culture, and the gate often provided the first real glimpse of what lay beyond. She wondered idly what state the people driving through these gates called home, whether they recognized the subtle signs that distinguished a tight professional unit from one where problems festered beneath the surface. 20 minutes elapsed with Brennan making phone calls that seemed designed more for show than necessity. He spoke into his radio twice, listened to responses, nodded to himself, and made additional calls on his cell phone. The three guards had returned to their positions processing other vehicles, but their glances toward her parked car came at regular intervals, checking to see if she showed frustration or impatience. She gave them neither, using the time to review her processing checklist and mentally prepare for the day ahead. Military life had taught her that unnecessary delays were often tests of temperament, unofficial assessments conducted by small-minded individuals seeking reactions they could later use as justification for their behavior. Brennan finally approached her vehicle, returning her documents with a casualness that contrasted sharply with the extended delay he had imposed. Everything checked out, he informed her, as if this had ever been in question. Then came the parting comment, delivered as she prepared to drive forward, words about staying in her lane wrapped in the thin veneer of professional advice. The phrase carried implications beyond its surface meaning, a suggestion that she remember her place in whatever hierarchy Brennan imagined himself commanding. She accepted her documents, thanked him with the proper military courtesy, and proceeded through the gate toward the installation that would become her new home. The interaction lasted 37 minutes from arrival to clearance, 25 of those spent waiting for verification that any competent gate officer could have completed in under 2 minutes. Voss had encountered this particular brand of petty authority before, individuals who wielded small amounts of power like clubs, testing boundaries to see who would push back and who would simply endure. She filed the incident away in her mental catalog, not as something requiring immediate action, but as a data point suggesting this Lieutenant Brennan bore watching. Fort Carson spread before her as she drove deeper into the installation, buildings and training areas laid out with the geometric precision that characterized military construction, and she wondered what other dynamics she would discover during her first weeks at this new assignment. The morning sun finally crested the eastern horizon, burning away the last traces of haze and illuminating everything in sharp detail. The processing day consumed 12 hours of paperwork, briefings, and facility orientations that reduced Fort Carson from an abstract concept to a concrete reality with specific buildings, personnel, and procedures. Voss returned to the main gate at 1800 hours, her vehicle loaded with temporary quarters assignments and in-processing documents that would govern her first month at the installation. The same crew remained on duty, their shift apparently running from early morning through evening, and she recognized Lieutenant Brennan's silhouette in the fading light before her headlights fully illuminated the checkpoint. Brennan stepped forward as she approached, recognition crossing his features immediately. "Back again," he asked, the question formatted as inquiry, but delivered with an edge that transformed it into commentary. "You get lost, Sergeant." The words came without the question mark that grammar would have demanded, making it clear he expected no actual response. Voss presented her exit authorization through the window, the document properly signed by the installation duty officer and marked with that day's authentication code. Everything was in order, the authorization clear and unambiguous. Yet Brennan studied it, as though searching for irregularities that his morning examination of her entry credentials had failed to uncover. She waited with the engine idling, aware that the 3 gate guards had shifted their positions to observe this interaction with the same attention they had shown during the morning encounter. Brennan circled to the front of her vehicle, placed one hand flat on the hood, and declared that she needed to exit for a vehicle inspection. His tone carried the weight of official procedure, but his positioning told a different story, blocking her path forward while making demands unsupported by regulation. Voss responded by citing the specific military code requiring reasonable suspicion for vehicle searches, her voice level and professional, offering information rather than challenge. The lieutenant's expression hardened at her response. He stated flatly that he did not need to explain himself to a non-commissioned officer, the emphasis on her rank designed to establish hierarchy where regulation had failed to provide justification. The verbal exchange had reached an impasse, suspended in that particular tension where military courtesy and lawful authority intersected with personal antagonism. Voss made the tactical decision to exit her vehicle rather than extend the confrontation, stepping out and assuming the position of attention despite the obvious fact that Brennan stood several inches shorter than her frame. He began circling her with deliberate slowness, his movement calculated to create discomfort through proximity and implied threat. "Women thinking they can do men's jobs," he said, the phrase emerging as if completing thoughts he had been developing throughout the day since their morning encounter. His circuit brought him close enough that she could hear his breathing, close enough that the guards watching from their stations would interpret this as intimidation rather than inspection. The entire performance seemed designed to provoke reaction, to generate some response that would justify escalation or provide grounds for official complaint. Voss maintained her position at attention, eyes forward, posture correct, giving him nothing. The 2 guards who had merely watched during the morning encounter now stepped closer to Brennan's position, the movement suggesting readiness to follow whatever orders might come. The 3rd guard remained at his station but had abandoned any pretense of processing other traffic, his full attention locked on the scene developing in the lane Voss occupied. The checkpoint had effectively ceased functioning as other vehicles routed to the remaining open gates, drivers apparently familiar enough with the dynamics to recognize when one lane had become unavailable due to unofficial business. 5 minutes passed with Brennan continuing his commentary about women in combat roles, female soldiers seeking attention, and the general degradation of military standards. His words followed familiar patterns that Voss had encountered before from individuals who viewed integration as personal affront rather than institutional necessity. She let the statements wash past without acknowledgement, neither agreeing nor arguing, simply existing in the professional silence that regulations required of an NCO being addressed by an officer. The technique had worked before with similar personalities, allowing them to exhaust their need for dominance without receiving the emotional reaction they sought. Brennan finally stepped back, his frustration evident in the sharp gesture he used to wave her back toward her vehicle. "I'll be watching you," he said, delivering the words as warning rather than simple statement of fact. The phrase carried implications of continued scrutiny, promised future encounters, suggested that their interactions were far from concluded. Voss acknowledged with the proper courtesy, returned to her vehicle, and proceeded through the gate while watching Brennan's reflection in her rearview mirror. He stood in the lane watching her departure, hands on his hips, silhouette rigid against the darkening sky. The evening air had cooled considerably from the morning temperature, and Voss adjusted her vehicle's climate controls as she navigated toward her temporary quarters. 2 encounters with the same officer, both marked by unnecessary delays and increasingly aggressive posturing, established a pattern that experience warned her would likely continue. The question was not whether Brennan would engineer a third confrontation, but rather what form that confrontation would take, and how far his apparent need to establish dominance would push him beyond the boundaries of acceptable conduct. She filed this second interaction alongside the morning's incident, building a mental record that might prove necessary if his behavior escalated beyond verbal intimidation and bureaucratic harassment into territory requiring formal response. The third morning arrived with cloudless skies and temperatures that promised heat by afternoon. Voss approached the main gate at 0645, her schedule demanding another day of administrative processing that would complete her installation in-brief requirements. She observed Brennan's figure at the checkpoint from 200 meters out, his stance recognizable even at distance, and felt the situation's trajectory crystallizing with the clarity that combat experience provided. Some confrontations announced themselves in advance through accumulated tension and escalating patterns, allowing those with proper training to prepare mentally for violence while hoping circumstances would permit its avoidance. Brennan saw her vehicle approaching and stepped directly into the roadway, forcing her to brake earlier than traffic flow required. His positioning was deliberate, planting himself in her path rather than waiting at the standard checkpoint position where credentials would normally be examined. Voss brought her vehicle to a complete stop, noting that all 3 gate guards had abandoned their stations to cluster near Brennan, forming a loose semicircle that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The lieutenant gestured sharply for her to exit immediately, his command delivered through the windshield before she could lower her window or present any documentation. She complied with the order, stepping from her vehicle onto the concrete roadway while the morning sun cast long shadows across the checkpoint infrastructure. Brennan closed the distance between them before she could ask what issue required her exit, his approach aggressive and rapid. "You disrespected an officer," he stated, the accusation emerging without preamble or specifics. "During your previous encounters." The addition came as afterthought, as if the timing of this alleged disrespect was less important than its existence as justification for whatever was about to occur. Voss maintained her professional composure and stated factually that she had shown proper military courtesy at all times during their interactions. Her tone carried no defensiveness, simply offering information that both of them knew to be accurate. The gate camera system had recorded every moment of their previous encounters, every word exchanged, every gesture made. This knowledge sat between them unspoken. Yet Brennan proceeded as though documentation did not exist or would not matter when reviewed by higher authority. The lieutenant stepped forward until his face hovered inches from hers, his voice rising to a shout about knowing her place and respecting rank. Spittle accompanied the words, and Voss could see the veins in his neck standing out with the force of his delivery. She remained motionless, fighting every instinct that 15 years of combat had ingrained. Instincts that screamed about threat proximity and the danger of allowing potential attackers inside her defensive perimeter. Military discipline held her in place, the understanding that moving now would provide him exactly the justification he seemed to be seeking. Brennan's hand shot out and struck her shoulder with enough force to rock her back half a step. "You just assaulted an officer," he declared immediately, the accusation delivered before she had fully absorbed the impact. His face showed satisfaction, as though he had successfully maneuvered her into a trap that made everything to follow defensible and justified. The three guards watched with expressions ranging from shock to anticipation, witnesses to an event that their subsequent statements would need to characterize for official record. Voss recovered her balance and stated clearly that she had not initiated any physical contact. Her voice remained level despite the adrenaline now flooding her system, despite the tactical awareness calculating distances and angles and vulnerabilities. Brennan had created his pretext through action rather than receiving it through her response, manufacturing the grounds for escalation out of his own behavior. The situation had crossed from harassment into assault, from unofficial antagonism into criminal conduct. Yet she maintained her position and waited to see how far he intended to push beyond the boundary he had already violated. His hand dropped to his sidearm, fingers wrapping around the grip while his voice rose to full volume. "You're threatening me," he shouted, the accusation absurd given that she had not moved or spoken any threat. His fingers released the holster retention, and she heard the mechanical click that preceded the weapon's removal. "I'm in fear for my safety," he continued, building his narrative even as he drew his pistol from its secured position. The Beretta M9 emerged into the space between them, and Voss felt time compressing in the way it always did when violence transitioned from potential to imminent. The moment the weapon cleared leather, she moved. Her right hand intercepted his wrist before the barrel could rise toward any target, her thumb driving into the pressure point that controlled his grip strength while simultaneously blocking the hammer from falling even if his finger found the trigger. Her left hand secured his elbow as she rotated his entire arm, using the momentum of his own drawing motion against him, redirecting the weapon's trajectory away from any person while maintaining absolute control over its position. The technique was textbook disarmament, practiced 10,000 times across her career, executed now with a precision that separated instructor-level competence from basic proficiency. Brennan tried to maintain his grip, but his hand opened involuntarily as nerve pressure overrode conscious control. The pistol dropped into her free hand while she pivoted behind him, maintaining wrist control and pulling him off balance. He attempted to strike backward with his left hand, a desperate flailing motion that she redirected smoothly, using his own force to guide him toward the ground rather than resisting it. His feet left the pavement briefly as momentum carried him forward and down, her control ensuring he landed on his knees rather than his face, preventing injury while establishing complete dominance of the situation. She maintained her grip on his wrist with one hand while securing the pistol at her side with the other, thumbing the safety to its engaged position and ensuring the weapon pointed at nothing but concrete. The entire sequence from initial draw to final position consumed 45 seconds according to the gate camera timestamp that would later be reviewed frame by frame during investigation. Brennan knelt on the roadway, breathing hard, shock replacing the aggression that had driven him to draw his weapon. The three gate guards stood frozen with hands near their own pistols, but not committing to the draw, their faces showing the confusion of witnesses trying to process events that contradicted everything their lieutenant had told them to expect. Voss's voice emerged calm and measured, requesting they call military police because the lieutenant needed medical evaluation and the situation required official documentation. Her tone suggested routine rather than emergency, professional concern rather than triumph, the measured response of someone who had simply defended herself within the boundaries that law and regulation permitted. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez received the radio call at 0652 while reviewing the morning shift rotation schedule in the security office. Gate checkpoint incident, the dispatcher reported, officer down, weapon involved, situation controlled. The sparse details provided no clarity about whether this was medical emergency, security breach, or something else entirely, but the combination of elements demanded immediate supervisor response. Rodriguez grabbed his gear and headed for the main gate, covering the distance in his vehicle within 3 minutes, while running through mental protocols for different scenarios. The scene that greeted him defied easy categorization. Lieutenant Brennan knelt on the pavement with a woman standing behind him, maintaining what Rodriguez immediately recognized as a control position, professional and measured. The 3 gate guards clustered nearby, with expressions suggesting shock rather than active threat response, their body language indicating the situation had concluded rather than remained in progress. Rodriguez exited his vehicle and approached, his training cataloging details automatically while his conscious mind worked to construct narrative from physical evidence. The woman identified herself as Master Sergeant Voss and handed him Brennan's sidearm with proper clearing procedure, magazine released, and chamber shown empty before passing the weapon grip first. Her movements demonstrated familiarity with firearms handling that went beyond basic qualification, the smooth efficiency of someone who had performed these actions countless times. Rodriguez accepted the weapon and secured it while Brennan began speaking rapidly from his position on the ground, demanding that Voss be arrested immediately for assault on an officer and theft of military property. The lieutenant's voice carried outrage and certainty, his narrative depicting himself as victim of unprovoked attack by an NCO who had somehow managed to overpower him and steal his weapon. The 3 gate guards nodded along with portions of this account, though Rodriguez noted their nodding lacked conviction, more reflexive support for their officer than confident agreement with his version of events. He looked at Brennan more carefully, searching for signs of injury that would corroborate claims of assault, and found none. No blood, no visible bruising, no torn uniform or scraped skin that typically accompanied physical altercations violent enough to disarm an armed officer. Voss provided her statement in concise military format, facts delivered without emotion or editorializing. Lieutenant drew his weapon after creating physical contact and verbal justification. She said, her word choice precise and legally informed. I responded with minimal necessary force to secure the weapon and prevent escalation. The contrast between her measured delivery and Brennan's agitated demands was stark, and Rodriguez felt his assessment of the situation shifting based not on what was said but how each party presented their account. The guards offered their observations when Rodriguez questioned them directly, describing how the confrontation had unfolded. Their statements supported the basic sequence Voss had outlined, though they characterized her actions as aggressive and Brennan's weapon draw as defensive response to threat. Rodriguez listened without interruption, noting the inconsistencies between their description of threat and the complete absence of injury on their lieutenant. If Voss had been aggressive enough to warrant weapon draw, Brennan should be showing signs of the struggle that preceded disarmament. Instead, he knelt unharmed on pavement, dignity wounded but body intact. Military police arrived within minutes of Rodriguez's call, 2 vehicles carrying 4 MPs who secured the scene and began preliminary documentation. The MP lieutenant, a woman named Walsh, took initial statements while Rodriguez made his decision about evidence preservation. Gate camera footage, he told Walsh, covers this entire area with multiple angles. We need to review it before making any arrests or determinations. His emphasis on the word before was deliberate, establishing that conclusions drawn without evidence review would be premature and potentially wrong. Brennan's agitation increased at mention of cameras, his demands for immediate arrest growing more strident. Rodriguez observed this reaction with interest, wondering why someone confident in their account would resist evidence review. Walsh agreed with his assessment, directing her MPs to maintain scene security while she accompanied Rodriguez to review footage. Brennan protested that protocol required suspect detention, using regulations selectively to support his preferred outcome. Rodriguez calmly informed him that security protocol for all weapon-involved incidents required footage review before action, citing the actual regulation that Brennan either did not know or chose to ignore. The walk back to the security office took 2 minutes, Walsh keeping pace beside Rodriguez while discussing what they had observed. Her assessment aligned with his own instincts, the physical evidence not matching the assault narrative Brennan had constructed. No visible injuries on the lieutenant suggested control and restraint rather than aggression from Voss, Walsh noted. If she had actually attacked him violently enough to steal his weapon, he would be showing defensive wounds at minimum. The logic was sound, supported by both their law enforcement experience and basic understanding of how physical confrontations left marks on participants. Rodriguez accessed the camera system and pulled up footage from the main gate, multiple angles available covering the checkpoint from different perspectives. He started playback from the point where Voss's vehicle appeared in frame, letting the sequence run without comment. Walsh leaned forward as the scene unfolded, Brennan stepping into the roadway to force the stop, his aggressive approach to the vehicle, the escalation of verbal confrontation visible even without audio. The physical contact came clearly into frame, Brennan's hand striking Voss's shoulder while she remained motionless, his immediate accusation of assault captured in his animated gestures and facial expression. Then came the weapon draw, Brennan's hand dropping to his sidearm and pulling it free of the holster. Walsh's breath caught audibly as Voss moved, the speed and precision of her response remarkable even at normal playback speed. Rodriguez watched the disarmament sequence frame by frame, observing how she controlled Brennan's weapon hand while redirecting his body, how she guided rather than forced his descent to the pavement, how she secured the pistol while maintaining position that prevented any continuation of hostilities. The entire sequence from draw to control lasted exactly 45 seconds according to the timestamp overlay. Walsh sat back in her chair and spoke carefully, her words measured with the weight of what they had just witnessed. That was textbook defensive disarmament, she said. Perfect execution, minimum force, complete control. She pulled up Voss's service record on her tablet while Rodriguez reviewed earlier footage, scrolling back to see if context from previous days would illuminate the morning's incident. He found both prior encounters captured in detail, Brennan's pattern of escalation visible across 3 separate days of interaction. The first day showed unnecessary delay and dismissive comments. The second day revealed aggressive vehicle inspection demands and circling intimidation. The third day culminated in the weapon draw that had brought them all to this moment. Walsh watched these earlier recordings with growing anger visible on her face, professional composure maintained but barely. He created the entire confrontation, she stated flatly, manufactured grounds for weapon draw through his own actions, then tried to claim she assaulted him. The evidence contradicted every element of Brennan's narrative, supported every aspect of Voss's account, and revealed a pattern of misconduct that extended across 72 hours of documented interaction. Rodriguez scrolled the footage back further, curiosity driving him to examine whether Brennan's behavior toward Voss represented anomaly or pattern extending beyond their 3 documented encounters. Walsh contacted the provost marshal from her position beside him, providing initial assessment while he navigated through archived recordings from the previous 2 weeks. The camera system stored 30 days of continuous footage from all gate positions, digital files organized by date and camera number that made systematic review possible, though time-consuming. He found the first incident 4 days before Voss's arrival, Brennan interacting with a female captain whose name tape identified her as Martinez. The exchange appeared routine initially, credential check and vehicle inspection following standard protocol, but Brennan's hand placement on Martinez's lower back as she walked past him was clearly visible. Her reaction was immediate and unmistakable, body recoiling from contact while her face showed discomfort bordering on revulsion. She did not stop or confront him, instead continuing to her vehicle while Brennan smiled at her departure, apparently satisfied with whatever message his touch had conveyed. Walsh's expression hardened as she watched this footage. "That's assault," she said quietly, the legal term hanging in the air between them, while Rodriguez continued searching for additional incidents. He found another the following day, different female soldier detained for vehicle inspection that stretched past 30 minutes despite her obvious possession of proper credentials and departure authorization. Brennan circled her car multiple times, opened doors and examined contents with theatrical thoroughness, engaged her in conversation that her body language suggested was unwelcome. The timestamp showed she finally departed after 37 minutes, nearly 40 times longer than typical gate processing required. Rodriguez identified 3 more incidents over the next week, each involving female personnel, each characterized by either inappropriate physical contact or excessive detention without legitimate grounds. One showed Brennan blocking a female sergeant's exit while he wrote down her contact information, the woman's face showing resignation rather than consent. Another captured him leaning into a driver's window with proximity that violated professional distance norms, his face close enough to hers as she pressed back against her seat to maintain space. The pattern was undeniable, documented across multiple days with multiple victims, each incident preserved in digital clarity that would survive any attempt at denial or revision. Walsh pulled up military personnel database on her tablet, cross-referencing the name tapes and vehicle registrations visible in the footage with service records. Captain Jennifer Martinez, she read aloud, logistics officer assigned to 3rd Brigade. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Taylor, intelligence analyst with 10th Special Forces. 2nd Lieutenant Ashley Harris, new assignment last month to installation headquarters. She continued through the list, building a roster of potential victims whose testimony would be needed for comprehensive investigation of Brennan's conduct. Rodriguez felt anger building as the scope of misconduct became clear. How many times has this happened off camera? He wondered aloud, thinking about interactions at other locations without surveillance coverage, encounters during different shifts when the lieutenant might have felt even less constrained by potential observation. Walsh shared his frustration but channeled it toward procedural next steps, her training as investigator providing structure for response. "We need to interview all of them within 24 hours, she stated, before Brennan or anyone else has opportunity to influence their statements or suggest they misremembered events. The provost marshal arrived at the security office within 15 minutes of Walsh's call. Colonel James Patterson, bringing the authority necessary to transform preliminary findings into formal investigation. Rodriguez briefed him while playing the complete sequence of footage, starting with the earliest Martinez incident and progressing through each subsequent event until reaching that morning's weapon draw and disarmament. Patterson watched without interruption, his face revealing nothing until the final frame stopped playing and silence filled the small office. "How long has Brennan been assigned to gate security?" Patterson asked, the question directed at Rodriguez, whose personnel knowledge encompassed the entire security detachment. 18 months, Rodriguez replied, since he arrived as new lieutenant from ROTC commissioning program. Patterson absorbed this information and performed quick mental calculation that Rodriguez could almost see occurring behind his eyes. 18 months of opportunity, Walsh said, voicing what they were all thinking. 18 months of access to every person entering or leaving this installation, especially those isolated or vulnerable or simply trying to do their jobs without confrontation. Patterson made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, his authority mobilizing resources across the installation. JAG office would assign prosecutor to begin building case documentation. Installation commander would be briefed within the hour on situation requiring immediate attention. Brennan would be suspended from duty pending formal investigation and restricted to quarters with movement monitored. The machinery of military justice was engaging, procedures designed to handle misconduct activating in response to evidence that demanded accountability. Rodriguez raised questions that had been forming since they identified the pattern of victims. "What about the gate security supervisor who oversees Brennan's shift?" he asked. Staff Sergeant Shun has been his immediate supervisor for the entire 18 months, would have reviewed any complaints filed against personnel under his authority. The implication was clear without requiring explicit statement. If multiple women had experienced Brennan's harassment, at least some likely attempted to report through proper channels, and those reports would have reached Chen's desk for action or dismissal. Walsh pulled Chen's service record and found the connection Rodriguez had suspected might exist. He and Brennan attended same ROTC program. She reported, commissioned within 6 months of each other before receiving assignments that brought them both to Fort Carson. The relationship suggested loyalty that might supersede professional obligation, friendship that could explain why complaints about Brennan's conduct never resulted in corrective action or higher-level review. Patterson's jaw tightened visibly as this information registered, recognizing that the investigation had expanded beyond single officer's misconduct into potential institutional failure to protect personnel from documented pattern of abuse. The colonel made a fourth call, this one directing immediate reassignment of Staff Sergeant Chun pending separate investigation into his supervisory responsibilities and complaint handling procedures. Rodriguez would assume acting supervisor role for gate security effective immediately, bringing someone without prior connection to Brennan into position of authority over the detachment. Patterson wanted complete review of all complaints filed within the past 18 months regardless of resolution status, looking for pattern of dismissal or minimization that would indicate systematic protection of Brennan despite clear evidence of problems. Rodriguez accepted the temporary promotion, knowing it came with responsibility to rebuild trust that Chin's leadership had apparently violated. The gate security detachment consisted of 40 personnel working rotating shifts across multiple checkpoints, and every one of them would need to understand that misconduct would no longer be tolerated or concealed regardless of who committed it or what relationships protected them previously. Patterson departed to brief the installation commander, leaving Walsh and Rodriguez to begin the intensive interview process that would document the full scope of Brennan's harassment and identify any additional victims beyond those captured on camera. They started compiling interview lists, beginning with the 5 women clearly visible in footage, but expanding to include anyone who might have filed complaints or reported concerns about the lieutenant's behavior. Martinez's name topped the list, her status as captain suggesting she might have been confident enough to document her experience despite Chin's presence as supervisor. Walsh would conduct these interviews personally, recognizing that female victims might be more comfortable discussing harassment with female investigator, especially one carrying authority that could ensure their statements led to actual consequences rather than dismissal. Captain Jennifer Martinez arrived at the Provost Marshal's office at 1400 hours, her uniform crisp and her bearing professional despite visible tension in her shoulders and jaw. Walsh greeted her in the interview room, a space designed to be non-threatening, with comfortable chairs and neutral colors rather than the harsh interrogation aesthetic that characterized other areas of the military police facility. Martinez accepted offered water and settled into her seat, hands folded on the table in front of her, while Walsh explained the purpose of their meeting. "We're investigating Lieutenant Brennan's conduct at the main gate," Walsh began, her tone making clear this was formal inquiry rather than casual conversation. "Security footage shows an incident between you and the lieutenant on the morning of October 1st. Martinez's face showed immediate recognition of the date, tension increasing visibly as memory of that encounter surfaced. "He touched me," she said quietly, the words emerging with difficulty despite her captain's rank and obvious strength of character. "Placed his hand on my lower back as I walked past during gate processing, held it there for several seconds until I pulled away." Walsh asked her to describe the complete interaction from beginning to end, and Martinez complied with detail that suggested the memory remained vivid despite weeks having passed. Brennan had processed her credentials normally, she explained, checking her identification and vehicle registration according to standard procedures. She stepped out of her vehicle to access paperwork from the trunk when a physical contact occurred, his hand settling on her lower back with pressure that felt deliberately intimate rather than accidental brush. His fingers had moved slightly, almost caressing motion that removed any possibility of innocent interpretation. "I filed complaint with Staff Sergeant Chun the same day," Martinez continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved from describing the assault to discussing her attempt to address it through proper channels. "Provided written statement about the incident and requested investigation." Chen had accepted her complaint with visible discomfort. she recalled, reading through her account without meeting her eyes before informing her that Brennan was just being friendly and probably didn't mean anything inappropriate by the contact. The dismissal had been immediate and complete, no investigation conducted, no interview with Brennan performed, no documentation entered into official records. Walsh made notes while Martinez spoke, her own anger carefully controlled, but evident in the precise way her pen moved across paper. "Did Brennan's behavior toward you change after you filed a complaint?" she asked. Martinez shook her head, explaining that she had avoided the main gate entirely after Chen's dismissal of her concerns, choosing instead to use the auxiliary entrance that added 15 minutes to her commute but removed risk of encountering the lieutenant. The fact that she had altered her daily routine to avoid harassment rather than seeing her harass her face consequences spoke volumes about the command climate Chen had created. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Taylor's interview followed Martinez's, her account describing different harassment pattern but similar dismissal by supervisory authority. Brennan had detained her for vehicle inspection 3 times over 2 weeks, Taylor explained, each inspection lasting between 30 and 40 minutes despite her vehicle containing nothing but gym bag and work materials. During the 3rd detention, he had suggested she could avoid future delays if she met him for coffee sometime, the implicit quid pro quo obvious despite his casual phrasing. She had declined and filed complaint with Chun, receiving response that Brennan was probably just trying to be social and she shouldn't read too much in a friendly invitation. Second Lieutenant Ashley Harris proved the most reluctant interview subject, her recent commissioning making her acutely aware of power dynamics and potential career consequences. Walsh spent additional time establishing trust, explaining that the investigation was seeking truth rather than reasons to doubt victims. Harris eventually described how Brennan had cornered her at the gate during her 2nd week at Fort Carson, asking personal questions about her relationship status and living arrangements while blocking her vehicle's exit with his body position. She had not filed formal complaint because she was brand new to the installation and feared that reporting superior officer would mark her as troublemaker before her career even began. 3 additional women came forward after word of the investigation spread through informal channels, each describing similar patterns of inappropriate contact, excessive detention, or unwelcome personal questions. Walsh documented every account with care, noting commonalities that established Brennan's consistent methods while preserving each victim's unique experience and perspective. The interviews consumed 8 hours total, extending well into evening before Walsh finally completed the last statement and released her final interview subject. She compiled her findings in preliminary report for Colonel Patterson. 6 victims identified through combination of camera footage and self-reporting, pattern spanning 18 months from Brennan's arrival through that morning's weapon draw incident. Every victim who had attempted to file complaints described identical dismissal by Chun, his responses ranging from minimization to outright denial that any inappropriate conduct had occurred. The institutional failure was complete, creating an environment where Brennan operated without constraint while his supervisor actively protected him from accountability. Patterson reviewed the report with Rodriguez present, both men recognizing how thoroughly the gate security operation had failed in its most basic responsibility to maintain professional standards. The colonel authorized immediate expansion of investigation to examine Chen's handling of complaints, looking for documentary evidence that would either support or contradict victim accounts of his dismissal responses. Rodriguez began pulling personnel files and complaint records, searching official archives for any trace of the reports that Martinez and Taylor claimed to have filed. He found Martinez's complaint buried in administrative filing cabinet, never entered into electronic record system, and marked as resolved with no investigation required. Chen's handwritten note on the document stated that matter was discussed with complainant and determined to be misunderstanding rather than misconduct. Taylor's complaint was similarly filed, but not processed, notation indicating she had been counseled about maintaining positive working relationships with gate personnel. The documentary evidence confirmed systematic suppression of complaints, creating paper trail that would support charges against Chun for dereliction of duty in addition to Brennan's direct misconduct. Patterson made decision that night to recommend court-martial proceedings against Brennan for multiple violations, including assault, unlawful weapon use, conduct unbecoming an officer, and pattern of harassment spanning 18 months. Separate Article 15 proceedings would address Chin's supervisory failures, likely resulting in reduction in rank and transfer to assignment without supervisory responsibilities. The installation commander concurred with both recommendations after reviewing complete evidence package, investigation findings, and victim statements that painted damning picture of systemic failure at the main gate. Rodriguez assumed his new permanent role as gate security chief the following morning, accepting promotion that came with responsibility to rebuild operation from foundation. His first action was implementing new complaint reporting system that bypassed immediate supervisors entirely, creating direct channel to Provost Marshal's office for any harassment or misconduct allegations. The system included anonymous reporting option for those who feared retaliation, mandatory investigation requirements that prevented dismissal without evidence review, and regular audits to ensure compliance with procedures designed to protect rather than silence potential victims. Colonel Hammond, the installation commander, called emergency staff meeting to address the situation before rumors filled vacuum that accurate information should occupy. She briefed her senior leadership on investigation findings, emphasizing that institutional failure had enabled Brennan's misconduct and that Fort Carson would implement comprehensive reforms to prevent similar breakdowns in accountability. The briefing was frank about failures while promising concrete action, acknowledging harm done to victims while committing to cultural change that would make such behavior unacceptable and unsustainable. Colonel Patricia Hammond reviewed the complete investigation file in her office as morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the documentation that would determine multiple careers and potentially reshape installation culture. The Provost Marshal had delivered the compiled evidence at 700, 300 pages of statements, footage analysis, complaint documentation, and legal assessment that painted comprehensive picture of systemic failure. Hammond had commanded installations before and investigated misconduct cases ranging from minor infractions to serious crimes, but the calculated nature of Brennan's harassment combined with Chin's active suppression of complaints elevated this situation beyond typical disciplinary matter. She pulled Voss's service record first, wanting to understand exactly who Brennan had chosen to assault. 3 combat deployments emerged from the file, 2 to Afghanistan and 1 to Iraq, each deployment marked by commendations and valor awards that indicated exceptional performance under fire. 2 Bronze Stars with V device for valor in direct combat, 1 for leading evacuation of wounded soldiers under enemy fire when their helicopter was downed, another for holding defensive position alone for 40 minutes while her unit maneuvered. The citations detailed actions that demonstrated not just courage but tactical expertise and leadership under conditions that broke lesser soldiers. Her combatives training certifications filled an entire page, progression from basic qualification through advanced instructor levels until reaching level 5 master instructor designation that fewer than 200 soldiers in the entire Army had achieved. Hammond recognized the significance immediately. Level 5 meant Voss could teach other instructors, develop curriculum, serve as subject matter expert for hand-to-hand combat doctrine. Brennan had drawn his weapon on someone who could probably disarm him blindfolded, whose training exceeded anything his RODC background and 18 months of gate duty could possibly provide. Hammond placed Voss's file beside Brennan's record, the contrast stark even without detailed comparison. Brennan's service consisted of single assignment at Fort Carson following commission, no deployments, no special qualifications beyond basic officer training. His evaluation reports showed adequate performance in administrative duties, but noted in several places that he struggled with interpersonal relationships and received counseling for professional boundary issues. The evaluations never escalated to formal complaints, but pattern was visible for anyone reading critically. Multiple supervisors had identified concerning behavior without taking action that would have prevented escalation. The colonel convened emergency meeting in her conference room at 0900. Key personnel arriving with expressions ranging from concern to anger. Provost Marshal Patterson brought his case files and legal assessments. Rodriguez represented gate security with his preliminary findings about complaint suppression. JAG Captain Melissa Torres arrived with charging documents prepared for multiple courts-martial. Command Sergeant Major David Warren, Hammond's senior enlisted advisor, brought perspective from enlisted ranks about how this situation was being perceived and discussed throughout the installation. Hammond opened the meeting by stating her assessment bluntly. We have officer who spent 18 months systematically harassing female personnel, supervisor who actively suppressed complaints about that harassment, and gate security operation that became hostile environment for half our population. This isn't isolated misconduct, it's institutional failure. Her words left no room for minimization or excuse-making, establishing from the outset that responses would be comprehensive rather than limited to punishing individual actors. Torres briefed the legal framework for prosecution, multiple charges supported by overwhelming evidence. Assault charges stemmed from physical contact with Martinez and a shove delivered to Voss before weapon draw. Conduct unbecoming an officer covered the pattern of inappropriate comments and unwanted personal questions documented by multiple victims. The weapon draw itself constituted unlawful use of force, given that Voss presented no actual threat and Brennan manufactured justification through his own actions. Torres assessed conviction likelihood as near certain given camera footage and victim testimony that corroborated each other completely. Patterson added that Chun would face Article 15 proceedings for dereliction of supervisory duty, specifically his systematic dismissal of valid complaints without investigation or documentation. The evidence showed he received at least 3 written complaints over 18 months and buried all of them without forwarding to higher authority or conducting required inquiries. His friendship with Brennan, documented through their shared ROTC history, provided apparent motive for protection that violated his responsibilities as supervisor. Rodriguez presented his findings from reviewing gate security operations more broadly, identifying cultural problems that extended beyond Brennan and Chun. The gate guards who witnessed Brennan's escalating harassment had never reported concerns despite obvious pattern developing over time. Exit interviews with personnel rotating off-gate duty revealed widespread knowledge that Brennan targeted female personnel, yet this information never reached command level through any formal channel. The silence suggested either fear of retaliation or belief that reporting would accomplish nothing, both interpretations indicating broken trust between enlisted personnel and leadership. Warren provided enlisted perspective that confirmed Rodriguez's assessment. Word had spread rapidly through informal networks. He reported, with female soldiers sharing warnings about avoiding main gate and specific shifts when Brennan was on duty. The fact that enlisted community had developed workarounds rather than expecting leadership to address problem demonstrated how thoroughly the official complaint system had failed. Multiple soldiers had mentioned to Warren that they weren't surprised by investigation findings because everyone knew Brennan was a problem. They just didn't think anyone with authority cared enough to do anything about it. Hammond absorbed this information with visible frustration, recognizing that rebuilding trust would require more than punishing guilty parties. She announced immediate implementation of reforms designed to prevent recurrence and demonstrate commitment to accountability. All gate personnel would complete mandatory training on professional boundaries, harassment prevention, and proper complaint procedures. New reporting system would bypass immediate supervisors and create direct channel to Provost Marshal for sensitive complaints. Regular audits would review complaint handling to ensure investigations occurred and documentation was maintained properly. The colonel also directed installation-wide stand-down for harassment and assault prevention training. One full day when normal operations would pause to address cultural issues the investigation had exposed. Every unit would conduct facilitated discussions about professional standards, bystander intervention, and individual responsibility to report misconduct regardless of rank relationships. The stand-down would make clear that Fort Carson was serious about creating an environment where all personnel felt safe and respected regardless of gender. Torres recommended that Voss be formally recognized for her restraint during the disarmament, noting that her control prevented injury while defending herself against armed threat. Hammond agreed, directing submission of commendation medal citation, highlighting Voss's professional conduct under extreme circumstances. The recognition would serve dual purpose of honoring deserving soldier, while sending message that defending oneself appropriately against harassment would be supported rather than punished. Patterson raised concern about potential retaliation against victims who had come forward, suggesting protective measures while investigation proceeded toward court-martial. Hammond authorized monitoring of any interactions between Brennan associates and interview subjects, making clear that witness intimidation would result in additional charges. She also directed that victims receive priority access to installation support services, including counseling and legal assistance, ensuring they had resources needed to process their experiences and participate in prosecution without undue hardship. The meeting concluded with assignments distributed and timeline established for implementation of reforms. Court-martial proceedings would begin within 60 days, allowing time for complete preparation while demonstrating swift accountability. Chen's Article 15 hearing would occur within 2 weeks, faster timeline appropriate for administrative rather than criminal proceedings. Rodriguez would oversee Gates' security transformation with direct reporting to Patterson until new sustainable systems were proven effective. Warren would coordinate enlisted community outreach to rebuild trust and encourage reporting of any other unreported incidents that might exist. Hammond remained in conference room after others departed, reviewing timeline and mentally checking her decisions against 30 years of command experience. The situation demanded comprehensive response that balanced justice for victims with institutional reform, individual accountability with cultural change, swift action with thorough process. She felt confident the planned approach addressed all dimensions. But success would ultimately be measured not by courts-martial results, but by whether Fort Carson became a place where misconduct was reported immediately rather than whispered about helplessly. Lieutenant Jason Brennan sat in his bachelor officer quarters staring at walls that had become prison despite the absence of physical bars. Confinement pending court-martial meant restriction to these rooms except for approved appointments with his attorney, medical visits, or court appearances. The isolation gave him endless hours to replay the confrontation, his memory working desperately to reconstruct events in a way that made sense of how thoroughly everything had collapsed in 45 seconds. His recollection of a disarmament refused to align with objective reality. The speed of Voss's response existed in his mind as blur, hands moving faster than his perception could track, weapon leaving his grip before conscious thought registered the loss. He had trained on defensive tactics during ROTC, practiced weapon retention techniques in basic officer training, yet none of that preparation manifested when actual threat materialized, or what he had believed was threat. His certainty about danger now undermined by footage showing Voss standing motionless while he initiated all contact. Brennan had convinced himself during those first hours of restriction that the video must be misleading, camera angles creating false impression that he was aggressor rather than defender. His appointed JAG attorney disabused him of this fantasy during their initial consultation, playing the footage from multiple perspectives while maintaining professionally neutral expression that somehow conveyed judgment more effectively than words. "You can see yourself step into the roadway to stop her vehicle," the attorney had said, pointing at timestamp. "Here you approach aggressively. Here you strike her shoulder. Here you draw your weapon." The narration was clinical and devastating, each year marking another moment where Brennan's actions contradicted the defensive narrative he had constructed. The attorney had asked about his relationship with Staff Sergeant Chun, the question seemingly innocuous until context emerged. Chun was being investigated separately for complaint suppression. Her neutral tone informed him, implying that his ROTC friendship might have enabled misconduct through protection from accountability. Brennan experienced momentary relief that his friend would support his version of events, followed immediately by confusion when attorney explained Chun had been reassigned and would not be involved in his defense or investigation in any capacity. Learning about the victim interviews destroyed whatever false confidence Brennan had maintained. 6 women, his attorney reported, have provided statements describing pattern of harassment spanning your entire assignment at Fort Carson. The number seemed impossible at first, his mind unable to reconcile that figure with his perception of interactions as harmless friendliness or appropriate officer conduct. The attorney read portions of statements aloud, Martinez describing unwanted touching that made her avoid the main gate entirely, Taylor recounting multiple extended detentions that served no security purpose, Harris explaining how his personal questions made her feel trapped and vulnerable. Brennan's immediate response was denial and dismissal. They're exaggerating, he insisted, normal interactions being portrayed as misconduct because of current climate around these issues. His attorney's expression shifted from neutral to something approaching disgust. Lieutenant, the footage shows you placing your hand on Captain Martinez's back in a way that made her visibly recoil. It shows you detaining Staff Sergeant Taylor for 37 minutes while asking about her personal life. Multiple cameras from multiple angles captured these interactions exactly as the victims described them. The evidence was overwhelming in ways that prevented the mental gymnastics Brennan wanted to perform. He tried arguing that women were too sensitive now, that military had become feminized to the point where normal male behavior was criminalized. His attorney cut through this rationalization with brutal efficiency. You drew your weapon on an unarmed master sergeant who had not threatened you in any way. That's not normal male behavior. That's criminal assault with a deadly weapon. The legal framework did not care about his opinions regarding gender integration or appropriate conduct, only about what regulations and UCMJ articles said was permissible. Sleep became difficult as the reality of a situation penetrated defenses built from entitlement and rationalization. Brennan replayed not just the final confrontation, but the entire 18 months of his assignment. Memories now filtered through understanding that his actions had been observed, documented, and judged inappropriate by multiple authority figures whose opinions determined his future. Interactions he remembered as friendly flirtation appeared through new lens as harassment that created hostile environment. Delays he had justified as thorough security procedures revealed themselves as abuse of authority for personal gratification. His attorney recommended accepting plea agreement that prosecution was willing to offer, reduction in charges from multiple felonies to lesser offenses in exchange for guilty plea that would spare victims the trauma of testifying. Brennan rejected this immediately, insisting on his right to court-martial and full defense despite evidence stacked overwhelmingly against him. Some part of his psyche still believed that panel of officers would understand his perspective, that men in authority would recognize the impossible position created by integrated military where women serve alongside men, but somehow expected different treatment. The attorney warned that refusing plea meant victims would testify in open court, their statements entered into permanent record along with footage showing his escalating harassment across multiple encounters. Character witnesses would describe him as problem officer whose boundary violations had been noted but not addressed. Expert testimony would establish that Voss's defensive response was textbook appropriate force, while his weapon draw was unjustified and illegal. Conviction was virtually certain, attorneys stated flatly, and sentencing would be harsher after full court-martial than under the offered plea agreement. Brennan's confidence finally fractured completely as he contemplated what testimony would reveal. 6 women describing how his attention made them afraid, multiple witnesses explaining how they knew he was problem but felt powerless to address it, expert analysis demonstrating that he had drawn weapon on someone vastly more qualified in combat than he would ever be. The cumulative weight of evidence would paint picture of predatory officer abusing authority for personal gratification, and no amount of alternative framing could overcome video documentation and consistent victim testimony. He agreed to consider the plea agreement, his acceptance grudging and incomplete, but sufficient for attorney to arrange follow-up meeting with prosecutor. The terms were harsh, but realistic given evidence: dismissal from service and 6 months confinement in exchange for avoiding trial that would result in longer sentence and felony convictions that would haunt him beyond military. His career was over regardless. The question now only whether he would leave service as dishonorably discharged officer with criminal record or as dismissed officer with slightly less severe administrative separation. The isolation of restriction gave Brennan unwanted time for reflection he had avoided during active harassment. He examined his behavior through enforced perspective of someone facing consequences rather than operating with impunity, recognizing patterns that Chin's protection had allowed to continue unchecked. Every dismissed complaint had emboldened him. Every lack of accountability had communicated that his conduct was acceptable or at least tolerable. The systematic suppression of dissent had created an environment where he felt entitled to treat female soldiers as targets rather than colleagues. His attorney delivered final reality check during their last consultation before plea hearing. "You made choice every single day to abuse your authority," she said, professional facade dropping briefly to reveal personal anger at his conduct. "Multiple people try to stop you through proper channels and were silenced by your friend. The woman you drew your weapon on could have seriously injured you, but chose restraint you never showed anyone. You have no defense, no mitigation, and no sympathy from anyone who has reviewed this case. Take the plea or face maximum sentence after conviction that is absolutely certain." Brennan signed the plea agreement the following morning, his signature transforming 18 months of harassment into formal admission of guilt that would end his military service and begin his incarceration. The document felt like surrender and admission simultaneously, accepting legal consequences while still internally resisting full moral accountability for harm he had caused. Some part of him remained convinced that changing standards rather than his own behavior had created this situation, that he was victim of cultural shift rather than perpetrator of misconduct. This cognitive dissonance would persist even through sentencing and confinement, final refuge of someone unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths about his own character. The court-martial convened on a cold November morning 6 weeks after the incident, military justice moving with efficiency that civilian courts rarely achieved. Elena Voss arrived at the JAG facility in her dress uniform, ribbons and badges representing 15 years of service arranged with precision across her chest. She had testified in military proceedings before, providing expert witness statements about combat actions and tactical decisions, but never as victim in case where her own defensive response would face scrutiny alongside the criminal behavior that necessitated it. The courtroom held formal military bearing. Flags positioned behind the judge's bench and witness stand elevated to provide clear sight lines for the panel of officers who would determine Brennan's fate. Captain Torres, the prosecutor, greeted Voss in the witness preparation room and reviewed her testimony one final time. The questions would be straightforward, Torres explained, walking through the timeline of encounters and focusing particularly on the moments before Brennan drew his weapon. Defense counsel would attempt to suggest Voss appeared threatening due to her size and combat experience, but footage would contradict any claim that she initiated aggression. The proceedings opened with prosecution presenting the gate camera footage in its entirety, multiple angles displayed on screens positioned throughout the courtroom. The panel watched in silence as 3 days of escalating confrontation played out, Brennan's pattern of unnecessary delays and aggressive posturing building toward the final morning's violence. Voss observed the officers serving as jury, their faces revealing reactions ranging from anger to professional detachment as they witnessed behavior that violated every principle of military leadership and conduct. Colonel Marcus Chun took the stand as expert witness, his credentials establishing him as subject matter expert in military combatives and use of force. Torres walked him through frame-by-frame analysis of the disarmament sequence, Chin's testimony explaining the technique Voss employed and emphasizing the control it demonstrated. She executed textbook level 5 instructor response. He stated, using minimum necessary force to neutralize threat while preventing injury to the assailant. At any point during that 45 seconds, she could have broken his arm, dislocated his shoulder, or delivered strikes that would have caused significant trauma. She chose not to. The defense attorney, a major named Wilson who had been appointed to represent Brennan despite the overwhelming evidence, attempted to suggest that Voss's superior combat skills made her presence inherently threatening. Chun dismantled this argument methodically. Master Sergeant Voss stood at attention when Lieutenant Brennan approached aggressively. He replied when questioned. She maintained military courtesy throughout his verbal abuse. She did not move or react until he cleared his weapon from its holster and pointed it in her direction. Nothing about her behavior prior to his weapon draw could reasonably be interpreted as threatening by anyone with basic military training. Martinez testified next, describing the unwanted physical contact and her subsequent attempt to file complaint through proper channels. Her voice remained steady as she recounted Chin's dismissal of her concerns, the staff sergeant telling her that Brennan was just being friendly and she shouldn't make issues where none existed. Torres presented the written complaint Martinez had submitted, marked as resolved without investigation, and filed in administrative storage rather than processed through official channels. The documentary evidence corroborated her testimony completely, demonstrating systematic suppression that had enabled Brennan's continued misconduct. Taylor followed with her account of repeated detentions and inappropriate personal questions, describing how vehicle inspections that should have taken 3 minutes stretched to 40 while Brennan asked about her relationship status and suggested they meet for coffee. She had filed complaint after the third incident, receiving the same dismissal from Chun that Martinez experienced. Her testimony included detail that the extended detentions made her late for work multiple times, forcing her to explain to her commander why she consistently arrived after formation despite leaving her quarters with adequate time margin. Harris provided the perspective of junior officer targeted by superior, her testimony highlighting power dynamics that made reporting feel impossible. As brand new lieutenant with no connections at Fort Carson, she explained, filing complaint against more senior officer seemed like career suicide regardless of validity of concerns. She had absorbed the harassment silently, while developing strategies to avoid the main gate during shifts when Brennan worked, accepting reduced access to installation rather than risking retaliation for speaking up. 3 additional victims testified in succession, each describing similar patterns of inappropriate attention, excessive detention, and personal boundary violations. The cumulative weight of their statements established beyond doubt that Brennan's harassment of Voss represented culmination of sustained pattern rather than isolated incident. Torres presented timelines showing escalating severity of misconduct across 18 months, from uncomfortable comments through unwanted physical contact to the weapon draw that finally triggered intervention and accountability. The defense attempted to argue that Brennan's perception of threat from Voss justified his weapon draw regardless of objective reality. Wilson presented evidence of Voss's combat decorations and combatives qualifications, suggesting that reasonable officer could feel endangered by someone with such extensive training. The argument collapsed under cross-examination when Torres established that Voss had taken no threatening action, made no threatening statement, and maintained position of attention while Brennan escalated through verbal abuse to physical assault. Expert testimony from military psychologists addressed the question of whether Brennan's fear could be considered genuine even if objectively unreasonable. The psychologist reviewed Brennan's statements and behavioral patterns, concluding that his weapon draw stemmed not from fear but from anger at subordinate who refused to be intimidated by his authority. His pattern of targeting women, the expert noted, suggested need for dominance rather than legitimate security concerns. The weapon represented tool for reasserting control when verbal intimidation failed to produce desired submission. Voss took the stand late in the afternoon, her testimony concise and factual. Torres guided her through the 3 encounters, establishing timeline and Brennan's escalating aggression at each interaction. When asked about her response to the weapon draw, Voss described her actions in technical terms that emphasized defensive nature of her technique. He cleared the weapon from his holster, she stated. At that point, I responded to eliminate the threat while using minimum force necessary to prevent discharge or injury. The weapon was secured, he was controlled, and I immediately requested military police response. Wilson's cross-examination attempted to suggest that Voss could have simply stepped back or verbally de-escalated rather than physically engaging. Her response was measured but firm. When someone draws a weapon, stepping back may provide them clearer shot. Verbal de-escalation is not effective once deadly force has been introduced. My training and 15 years of combat experience informed my decision to neutralize the threat immediately using techniques designed to prevent injury while establishing control. Would you recommend different response to soldiers you train? The question turned his implied criticism back on him, forcing acknowledgement that her actions aligned with military doctrine. The panel deliberated for 90 minutes. They returned to the courtroom marked by expressions that suggested unanimous agreement had been reached quickly. The senior panel member delivered findings on each charge separately, guilty verdicts following one after another as Brennan stood at attention beside his attorney. Assault on Captain Martinez. Guilty. Conduct unbecoming an officer through pattern of harassment. Guilty. Assault on Master Sergeant Voss. Guilty. Unlawful use of deadly weapon. Guilty. The litany continued through all specifications. Complete conviction on every charge the prosecution had brought. Sentencing followed immediately, the panel recommending dismissal from service, 6 months confinement at military correctional facility, and reduction to the rank of private. The judge accepted these recommendations without modification, declaring that Lieutenant Brennan's conduct had violated the trust placed in officers and created an environment hostile to female service members. The sentence would send clear message that abuse of authority and harassment of subordinates would not be tolerated regardless of rank or relationships that had previously provided protection. Hammond addressed the court during closing remarks, her statement emphasizing institutional commitment to preventing similar failures. Fort Carson has implemented comprehensive reforms to complaint procedures and accountability systems, she stated. We failed the victims in this case by allowing misconduct to continue unchecked. That failure ends today. Her words acknowledged responsibility while promising corrective action, attempting to rebuild trust that systematic suppression had destroyed. Voss departed the courthouse as evening fell across Fort Carson. The proceedings concluded and justice delivered within time frame that many had doubted was possible. She felt no triumph in the outcome, only satisfaction that accountability had finally functioned after 18 months of systematic failure. The 6 women whose testimony had secured conviction deserved recognition for courage in coming forward despite reasonable fear that their statements would be dismissed again. The institutional reforms Hammond promised would determine whether this case represented turning point or merely temporary response to scandal that would fade once attention moved elsewhere. Rodriguez stood in the gate security office 3 weeks after the court-martial, reviewing implementation progress on reforms that would transform how Fort Carson handled harassment complaints and professional conduct violations. His promotion to permanent gate security chief had been formalized the previous week, recognition that his handling of the Brennan investigation demonstrated competence and integrity needed to rebuild operations that systematic failure had compromised. The office walls now displayed new complaint reporting procedures in prominent positions, bright posters with contact information bypassing supervisory chains that had previously enabled suppression. The new system required all harassment complaints to route directly to Provost Marshal's office regardless of command relationships or personal connections between involved parties. Anonymous reporting options provided protection for those who feared retaliation. Electronic submission system created permanent records that could not be buried in filing cabinets, and mandatory investigation requirements prevented dismissal without documented evidence review. Rodriguez had tested the system himself by submitting anonymous test complaint, verifying that it reached Patterson's desk within 2 hours and triggered automatic acknowledgement and case number assignment. Hammond had ordered installation-wide stand-down for harassment prevention training, one full day when normal operations paused to address cultural issues the investigation exposed. Rodriguez attended the session designed for supervisors and leaders, facilitated discussion covering bystander intervention, proper complaint handling, and individual responsibility to report misconduct regardless of rank relationships. The facilitator emphasized that supervisors who suppressed valid complaints would face consequences as severe as those who committed underlying harassment, establishing clear expectation that leadership meant protecting subordinates rather than protecting perpetrators. The Gate Security Detachment received specialized training beyond the installation-wide requirement, 40-hour course covering professional boundaries, de-escalation techniques, and appropriate use of authority. Voss had been requested to develop curriculum after Hammond recognized her expertise and willingness to contribute to institutional improvement. Rodriguez observed the first-class delivery, watching Voss demonstrate control techniques while explaining the principles that separated defensive response from aggressive escalation. Her teaching style was direct and practical, scenarios drawn from real situations, including her own experience with Brennan. The 3 gate guards who witnessed the confrontation without intervening completed the training alongside their peers, their participation marking transition from passive witnesses to active participants in maintaining professional standards. Rodriguez had counseled each of them individually about their failure to report Brennan's escalating harassment, explaining that silence enabled misconduct as effectively as active suppression. They would remain in their positions rather than face discharge, but their futures depended on demonstrating commitment to new cultural expectations through consistent professional conduct. Patterson briefed senior leadership on complaint statistics from the first month after system implementation, numbers revealing scope of issues that previous procedures had concealed. 17 complaints filed in 30 days, he reported, compared to average of 2 per month under the old system. The increase suggested not that harassment had worsened, but that personnel finally believed reporting would produce investigation rather than dismissal. Initial review indicated most complaints were valid concerns about boundary violations, inappropriate comments, or abuse of authority that would have been buried under Chen's supervision. Hammond authorized additional investigator positions within Provost Marshal's office to handle increased complaint volume, recognizing that effective system required resources matching commitment. She also directed creation of victim advocate programs staffed by trained personnel who could provide support throughout investigation and prosecution processes. Martinez volunteered to serve as one of the first advocates, her experience as victim informing her understanding of what support looked like from recipient perspective rather than institutional viewpoint. The installation newspaper published feature article about the case and subsequent reforms, balanced coverage that acknowledged failures while highlighting corrective actions. The article included interviews with Hammond, Patterson, and Rodriguez, each emphasizing commitment to accountability and cultural change. Victim names were protected per their requests, but article noted that 6 women had come forward with testimony that secured conviction. The publicity served dual purpose of informing Fort Carson population about new procedures while sending message that leadership took harassment seriously. Rodriguez implemented random audits of gate operations to verify that professional standards were maintained consistently across all shifts and checkpoints. Unannounced observations documented interactions between gate personnel and installation population, looking for patterns that might indicate emerging problems before they escalated to Brennan-level systematic abuse. Early results were encouraging, interactions professional and efficient with no indication of targeting based on gender or other characteristics. The reforms extended beyond gate security to encompass broader installation culture. Hammond directed all units to review their internal complaint handling procedures, ensuring that mechanisms existed for personnel to report concerns without fear that immediate supervisors would dismiss or suppress allegations. Command climate surveys added specific questions about harassment experiences and confidence in reporting procedures, baseline data that would allow tracking of improvement over time as cultural change took hold. Chen's Article 15 hearing resulted in reduction in rank from staff sergeant to specialist and transfer to logistics position without supervisory responsibilities. The punishment was administrative rather than criminal, but effectively ended his military career, reduction in rank making promotion impossible and removing any authority over other soldiers. He departed Fort Carson within a week of the hearing, reassignment to isolated duty station, ensuring he would not interact with any of the victims or witnesses whose complaints he had suppressed. Voss received Army Commendation Medal for her conduct during the confrontation, citation specifically noting her restraint and professional response under circumstances that would have justified more aggressive defensive action. Hammond presented the award during installation formation attended by 3,000 soldiers. Ceremony sending clear message that appropriate self-defense would be recognized and supported. The visibility was uncomfortable for Voss, who preferred to avoid attention, but she accepted that institutional change sometimes required public acknowledgement of private actions. Martinez assumed her new role as victim advocate with energy that came from transforming personal trauma into mechanism for helping others. Her office received steady stream of visitors in the weeks following system implementation, personnel seeking guidance about whether experiences constituted harassment and how to document concerns effectively. She provided information without judgment, empowering individuals to make informed decisions about reporting while ensuring they understood available support regardless of their choices. The reforms attracted attention beyond Fort Carson as Army leadership sought models for addressing harassment and accountability failures at other installations. Hammond briefed Pentagon officials on implementation approach and early results. Her presentation emphasizing that cultural change required commitment from command level rather than simply adding new procedures to existing broken systems. 7 installations requested detailed information about Fort Carson's complaint system and training curriculum, indicating potential for broader adoption if initial results prove sustainable. Rodriguez received inquiries from gate security chiefs at other posts seeking guidance on implementing similar reforms in their operations. He shared lessons learned about the importance of bypassing compromised supervisory chains, creating anonymous reporting options, and maintaining visible commitment to investigation of all complaints regardless of involved parties. The informal network of security professionals began developing standardized procedures that could be adapted to different installation contexts while maintaining core principles of accessibility and accountability. Taylor approached Rodriguez 6 weeks after the court-martial with request to join Gate Security Detachment. Her experience as victim informing desire to help prevent similar situations. He accepted her transfer request, recognizing that personnel with direct understanding of how harassment felt from victim perspective would strengthen the culture he was building. Her presence would serve as daily reminder to all Gate personnel that their actions affected real people with careers and dignity that deserved respect. Harris reported during installation climate survey that she finally felt comfortable using the main gate without anxiety about encountering harassment. Simple statement that represented profound shift in daily experience. Multiple other women provided similar feedback, noting that visible reforms and accountability for Brennan's misconduct had restored confidence that leadership would address rather than enable inappropriate behavior. The survey results provided quantitative validation that institutional changes were producing cultural improvements rather than merely creating appearance of action without substance. The spring morning brought temperatures that finally suggested winter's grip on Colorado had loosened, and Voss arrived at Fort Carson's combatives training facility to begin her new permanent assignment as senior instructor. Hammond had offered the position 3 months after the court-martial, recognizing that Voss's expertise and demonstrated judgment made her ideal candidate to develop training programs that emphasize control and professionalism rather than simply teaching violence. The facility occupied converted warehouse space with padded floors, heavy bags suspended from ceiling mounts, and mirrors along one wall, allowing students to observe their own technique during practice. Her first official action was developing curriculum specifically for junior officers and NCOs in supervisory positions. 40 hours of instruction covering not just physical techniques, but ethical framework for appropriate use of force. The program emphasized that combat skills carried responsibility to employ them only when necessary and always with restraint proportional to actual threat. Voss structured lessons around real scenarios drawn from her 15 years of experience, case studies that forced students to analyze when force was justified versus when de-escalation represented better tactical choice. Rodriguez attended the first course as student despite his security experience, wanting to understand the training his personnel would receive and demonstrate leadership commitment to continuous improvement. He found Voss's teaching style demanding but fair, her critiques of technique delivered with specific guidance for correction rather than simple criticism. The scenario work challenged assumptions about when physical response was appropriate. Several exercises requiring students to maintain professional bearing while being verbally berated or physically postured against by role-playing instructors. The Gate Security Detachment cycled through specialized version of the training tailored to their specific operational context. Voss developed scenarios mimicking common checkpoint interactions, practicing responses to aggressive drivers, intoxicated personnel, or individuals attempting to use rank to intimidate gate guards into bypassing security procedures. The training emphasized that guards had both authority and responsibility to maintain standards without escalating unnecessarily, finding balance between security requirements and professional courtesy that Brennan had so thoroughly violated. Hammond requested that Voss brief installation leadership on lessons learned from the confrontation, presentation focusing on how proper training enabled defensive response while preventing injury to attacker. The senior officers listened intently as she walked through the 45-second sequence frame by frame, explaining each decision point and available option at that moment. She could have broken his arm here, she noted at one point, but doing so would have been excessive given that weapon was already controlled. The restraint demonstrated level of expertise that came only from thousands of hours of practice combined with combat experience that taught difference between necessary and excessive force. The installation received formal recognition from Army Training Command for innovative approach to combatives instruction that integrated ethical considerations with physical techniques. The recognition brought requests from other posts to send their instructors for training under Voss's curriculum, expanding her influence beyond Fort Carson to shape how the Army approached teaching control violence. She developed Train the Trainer program, allowing qualified instructors from other installations to learn her methods and implement them in their own contexts. Martinez's Victim Advocate program expanded beyond initial vision as demand for services exceeded available resources. She trained additional advocates drawn from various specialties across the installation, building team capable of providing support to harassment victims while also assisting with other traumatic situations, including combat stress, family violence, and assault cases. The program's success demonstrated that institutional support for victims encouraged reporting rather than silence, cultural shift that made Fort Carson safer through accountability rather than concealment. Patterson's quarterly briefing on complaint statistics showed sustained high reporting levels 4 months after system implementation, numbers stabilizing around 15 complaints per month as personnel developed confidence that reports would be investigated properly. Resolution data indicated that roughly 60% of complaints were substantiated after investigation, leading to consequences ranging from counseling to court-martial, depending on severity. The remaining 40% were closed after investigation determined either no misconduct occurred or insufficient evidence existed to support findings. But even these cases received thorough review rather than summary dismissal. The 7 installations that had requested information about Fort Carson's reforms began implementing adapted versions of the complaint system and training programs. Hammond participated in working group developing Army-wide policy recommendations based on lessons learned from multiple pilot programs, her experience providing practical perspective on what worked versus what sounded good in theory but failed in practice. The working group's preliminary recommendations emphasized direct reporting channels, anonymous options, mandatory investigation requirements, and severe consequences for supervisors who suppressed valid complaints. Voss received invitation to testify before Senate Armed Services Committee about military culture and accountability, lawmakers seeking informed perspectives on how to address harassment and assault issues that multiple high-profile cases had brought to national attention. She accepted reluctantly, uncomfortable with political theater, but recognizing that institutional change sometimes required engaging with policymakers who controlled resources and regulations. Her testimony focused on practical reforms that Fort Carson had implemented successfully, emphasizing that cultural change demanded leadership commitment backed by concrete systemic changes rather than simply adding new paperwork requirements. Taylor's integration into Gates security operations brought perspective that enhanced training and procedures in ways Rodriguez had not anticipated. She identified several scenarios that male personnel had not considered problematic, but that female soldiers experienced as threatening or harassing. Her input led to refinements in standard operating procedures that clarified acceptable versus inappropriate interactions, removing ambiguity that had allowed personnel like Brennan to claim their behavior was normal rather than predatory. Harris was promoted to first lieutenant and assigned to installation headquarters as assistant to Hammond, position that leveraged her experience while providing mentorship from commander who took accountability seriously. The assignment sent message that reporting harassment would not damage careers, contradiction to fear that had kept Harris silent during her initial encounters with Brennan. She thrived in the role, using her perspective as former victim to inform policy recommendations that Hammond implemented across the installation. The article Chun had written to suppress complaints was published in Military Justice Journal as case study in supervisory failures and their consequences. The author analyzed how personal relationships between Chun and Brennan created conflict of interest that should have triggered recusal from complaint handling, how systematic suppression enabled escalation that might have been prevented through early intervention, and how institutional culture that prioritized loyalty over accountability created an environment where misconduct flourished. The publication ensured that Chen's failure would serve as cautionary example for supervisors throughout the military. Brennan completed 4 months of his 6-month sentence at Military Correctional Facility, his time marked by mandatory counseling and rehabilitation programs designed to address attitudes that contributed to his criminal conduct. Reports from facility staff indicated he participated without obvious resistance, but showed limited insight into how his behavior affected victims. Tendency towards self-pity rather than genuine remorse, suggesting his fundamental character remained unchanged. Upon release, he would receive dismissal characterization on his discharge, permanent mark preventing future military service and limiting civilian employment options. Voss received letter from former student she had trained 5 years earlier during deployment to Afghanistan, soldier writing to say that techniques she taught had saved his life during ambush when he was forced to defend himself against a knife-wielding attacker. The letter reminded her why she had dedicated career to teaching controlled violence rather than simply perfecting her own skills. Every student represented potential future situation where proper training might mean difference between survival and casualty, restraint and excessive force, professional conduct and criminal behavior. The responsibility was immense, but aligned with her values about military service as calling rather than simply job. Rodriguez recommended Voss for promotion to sergeant major based on her leadership of training programs and institutional impact beyond her official duties. Hammond endorsed the recommendation enthusiastically, noting in evaluation that Voss exemplified the professional standards and tactical expertise the Army needed in its senior enlisted leaders. The promotion board would convene in 6 months, but Rodriguez was confident her record and contributions made selection virtually certain barring unexpected circumstances. The reforms implemented at Fort Carson began appearing in official Army doctrine as policymakers incorporated lessons learned into regulations governing harassment prevention and complaint procedures. The speed of institutional adoption surprised Hammond, who had expected years of bureaucratic process before pilot programs translated into service-wide requirements. She attributed the rapid change to perfect storm of high-profile failures creating political pressure, Fort Carson providing proven model ready for implementation, and senior leadership genuinely committed to cultural transformation rather than merely managing public relations. Martinez organized support group for harassment victims at Fort Carson, monthly meetings providing safe space for discussing experiences and healing from trauma. Attendance ranged from 5 to 15 personnel, depending on operational tempo and deployment schedules, mix of active cases and resolved situations creating community of shared experience. The group's existence demonstrated institutional commitment to supporting victims beyond investigation and prosecution, recognizing that legal accountability alone did not address psychological and emotional impacts of harassment. 1 year after the confrontation, Voss drove through Fort Carson's main gate during the early morning commute, her vehicle processed efficiently by guards whose professionalism reflected the cultural transformation that systematic reforms had produced. Rodriguez greeted her with casual wave from the security office window, their relationship having evolved from investigator and witness into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to institutional improvement. The checkpoint that had been site of harassment and violence now functioned as it should have from the beginning, secure without being threatening, professional without being hostile. She parked at the combatives training facility and reviewed her schedule for the day, classes covering basic through advanced techniques for students ranging from new recruits through senior NCOs preparing for instructor certification. The curriculum she had developed over the past year emphasized principles rather than simply teaching moves, ensuring students understood why techniques worked and when their application was appropriate versus excessive. Every class began with discussion of legal and ethical framework governing use of force, establishing that physical skills carried responsibility to employ them only when necessary. Martinez stopped by Voss's office during the morning break between classes, bringing coffee and updates on the Victim Advocate program that had become permanent fixture at Fort Carson. For additional women had come forward in recent weeks with reports of harassment from different units. Martinez explained their willingness to report stemming from confidence that the system would respond appropriately rather than dismissing their concerns. Each case was being investigated thoroughly. 2 had already resulted in administrative punishments, while the other 2 remained under review pending additional evidence collection. The conversation shifted to Martinez's upcoming departure from Fort Carson, her orders taking her to Pentagon assignment, where she would help develop Army-wide victim support policies based on the successful model she had implemented. The position represented recognition of her expertise and commitment, opportunity to influence institutional culture at highest levels rather than just one installation. Voss congratulated her, while privately regretting the loss of someone whose perspective as victim-turned-advocate brought authenticity that no amount of professional training could replicate. Hammond requested Voss attend afternoon briefing for visiting delegation from Department of Defense, senior officials conducting assessment of Fort Carson's reforms with eye toward broader implementation across all military branches. Voss presented her training curriculum and discussed how integration of ethical considerations with physical techniques produced graduates who understood restraint as strength rather than weakness. The visitors asked detailed questions about measurable outcomes, seeking data that would support policy recommendations to Congress and service secretaries. Rodriguez provided statistics demonstrating that harassment complaints at Fort Carson had remained consistently high relative to pre-reform numbers, trend that data analysts correctly interpreted as increased reporting rather than increased harassment. The installation's substantiation rate for investigated complaints was 63%, he reported, indicating that vast majority of personnel coming forward had legitimate concerns rather than filing frivolous reports. Most importantly, Follow-up surveys showed that 91% of complainants felt their concerns had been taken seriously and investigated fairly regardless of whether findings supported their allegations. The delegation toured the gate security operation during shift change, observing professional interactions between guards and installation population that contrasted sharply with the hostile environment Brennan had created. Taylor, now fully integrated into the detachment, briefed visitors on training protocols and accountability measures that prevented individual misconduct from becoming a systemic pattern. Her presence as former victim who chose to join the organization she had been harassed by demonstrated that meaningful reform was possible when leadership committed to cultural change rather than merely managing perception. Hammond hosted dinner for the delegation that evening, informal setting allowing candid discussion about challenges encountered during implementation and lessons learned that might benefit other installations. She emphasized that sustainable reform required more than new procedures, demanding visible leadership commitment and willingness to hold senior personnel accountable when they failed to uphold standards. The Brennan case succeeded as catalyst for change because we acknowledged failure rather than defending broken system, she explained, and because we followed through with consequences that demonstrated seriousness of commitment. Voss returned to her quarters after the dinner and found a letter waiting from Harris, now stationed in Germany, but maintaining contact with those who had supported her through difficult initial months at Fort Carson. The letter described how Harris was using her experience to mentor junior female officers in her new unit, helping them recognize harassment early and empowering them to report rather than suffer silently. She credited Voss's example during the confrontation with teaching her that standing firm against abuse was possible and necessary, that expertise and professionalism provided foundation for demanding respect rather than accepting mistreatment. The evening brought reflection on how a single moment of defending herself had cascaded into institutional transformation affecting thousands of personnel across multiple installations. Voss recognized that the 45 seconds of physical action mattered less than what happened afterward. Investigation that revealed systematic failures, leadership willing to acknowledge those failures, and comprehensive reforms that addressed root causes rather than just punishing individual perpetrator. Her role had been catalyst rather than solution, providing visible example of appropriate response while others did harder work of changing culture. She considered whether similar courage from victims and witnesses might have prevented Brennan's escalation if Fort Carson's culture had supported reporting 18 months earlier. Martinez's attempt to file complaint after the first incident could have ended the pattern before additional victims suffered, but Chin's dismissal and Brennan's protection created an environment where silence seemed safer than speaking up. The reforms ensured future personnel would not face that impossible choice between accepting harassment and risking retaliation for reporting it. Voss wondered about the viewers who might hear this story, whether they had witnessed similar failures at their own installations or workplaces, whether they recognized the patterns of escalation and suppression that enabled misconduct to flourish. She thought about asking where they were from and whether military culture resonated with their own experiences, but ultimately the question was whether they understood that standing firm in one moment could create ripples extending far beyond immediate confrontation. Sometimes defending yourself meant defending everyone who would come after you, preventing future victims by refusing to accept treatment that normalized abuse. Her thoughts turned to the combatives class scheduled for the next morning, 40 soldiers ranging from private through captain who would learn techniques for controlling violence rather than simply inflicting it. She would teach them the physical mechanics of disarmament and restraint, but more importantly, she would teach them the mental discipline that separated professional warriors from thugs who used force to gratify personal needs. The distinction mattered enormously, defining whether military served its stated values or simply provided weapons to individuals unworthy of carrying them. The installation lights created artificial day across Fort Carson's landscape, security illumination ensuring that darkness provided no cover for those who might exploit it. Voss appreciated the metaphor perhaps too obviously, but the parallel between physical and institutional visibility held truth worth acknowledging. Accountability required making misconduct visible rather than allowing it to hide in shadows of dismissal and suppression, bringing behavior into light where it could be judged against standards and addressed through consequences. She prepared for sleep knowing that tomorrow would bring more students, more training, more opportunities to shape how the Army understood and employed control violence. The work was incremental and often frustrating. Cultural change measured in years rather than days. But the alternative was accepting that nothing would improve despite clear evidence that improvement was necessary. Brennan sat in correctional facility, completing his sentence. Career ended and future limited by criminal record that would follow him forever. The 6 women he harassed had received justice and support that previous victims were denied. Fort Carson had implemented reforms that made similar systematic failures far less likely. The 45 seconds that changed everything had demonstrated that expertise combined with restraint could overcome authority misused for harassment. The year that followed proved that institutions could change when leadership acknowledged failure and committed to meaningful reform rather than defensive denial. Voss closed her eyes confident that her contribution mattered, not because she was special, but because she had refused to accept treatment that normalized abuse, and that refusal had created space for others to demand better from systems designed to protect them, but too often failing in that basic responsibility. The story would continue beyond her individual role, reforms spreading and evolving as more installations recognized that accountability strengthened rather than weakened military culture, that protecting victims served readiness better than protecting perpetrators, and that standing firm in one moment could reshape futures for thousands who would never know her name, but would benefit from the changes her defense had catalyzed.